Angela. If you make sure
Hi, good evening everyone, and welcome to our session this evening, our rally. We've got some fantastic speakers. The rally is called The Impact of Covid-19, No Turning Back the Clock on Equality. And if you're not bored of seeing me on your TV screens already, then you can get me on your Zoom links. And for those that have been fortunate enough to escape me over the last week, I'm Angela Rayner, and I am absolutely proud to be your deputy leader of the Labour Party. And I'm absolutely honoured to share a platform with such distinguished, amazing sisters and women who we've got tonight. And I'll just run through the list of speakers that we've got. We've got Baroness Lawrence, and welcome to you, Doreen, and thank you for all the fantastic work you've been doing throughout this COVID situation and making sure that we hold our feet to the fire as well to make sure that we do our best. So thank you so much for that. We've got Marsha de Cordova, MP, who is a member of my leadership team and also the Shadow Women and Equalities Officer, a Member of Parliament and Secretary of State for that, and has been doing a fantastic job on holding the government to account, but also putting forward our ideas on how we can support each other. We've got Maria Exall, the National Trade Union Liaison Officer, is on the call as well. Jill Murdoch, the TSSA activist, the trade union TSSA. We've got Nell Andrew, the National Equality and Inclusion Officer for GMB. We've got Dr. Sonia Adesara, the NHS activist and doctor, and I think we've shared the platform before, Hun, so it's an absolute privilege to be on this platform with you again tonight. We've got Fran Springfield, the co-chair of Disability Labour, who I've been doing huge amounts of work with. She's a fantastic advocate, and I'm really pleased she's here. And Emily Thornberry, MP, who is the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade somewhere, hopefully. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to chair this event, hopefully, and it's probably one of the first events I've managed to chair as the national chair of the Labour Party, so bear with me. It's been one of those strange times during this pandemic, and we're going to start with a fantastic introduction from Marsha de Cordova. So Marsha, over to you, hon.
Thank you so much, Angela. And can I just echo my thanks for everybody that has taken part today, but especially to everybody that is part of this evening's rally. I am privileged and honoured to be sharing a platform with each of you. And can I also just say a special shout out to my dear friend, Fran Springfield, who has been doing an immense amount of work with Disability Labour and improving access for disabled people in our party and across our movement. So no one could have foresaw what was going to come this year when 2020 started, that we were going to have a global health pandemic that was really going to expose some of those structural inequalities, and also a virus that was reveling in some of those injustices. And we've seen the disproportionate impact that that has had on so many communities, whether it's on women, disabled people, or our Black and minority ethnic communities. We've seen that there was a disproportionate number of deaths among our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And if you are a Black man, you are 3 times more likely to have died from this pandemic than a white man. And we know that within the NHS and social care sector that our workers were being pushed onto the front line without adequate PPE. Many felt very fearful of even wanting to express or even challenge decisions that were being taken in relation to them on the front line. And I just want to say at this point, just a massive shout out to all the work that our nurses, our doctors and every frontline worker has been doing during this pandemic, and also for speaking out and being a voice to sometimes communities that actually have felt very voiceless throughout this. We know that 3/4 of those that passed away within the NHS were from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background. And this summer, the TUC published a fantastic report on dying on the job, which was really looking at racism at work. And we know that because of some of the unfair occupational discrimination that was taking place within our workplaces, our Black and ethnic minority workers were really put at a disadvantage, and there was such a hostile environment for so many of them. But also, as part of the government's economic packages, and we had the job retention scheme, we knew again that many of our workers were the ones that were put on the furlough scheme and also subject to redundancy. And then, despite all the evidence being put forward, when the government did finally agree to carry out a review led by Public Health England into COVID-19 and its impact on our Black and minority ethnic communities, they published a report, pretty much forced to publish a report of recommendations, just the 7 of them, and still we've not had much action from this government. So in my opinion, they are a government of inaction. And moving on to disabled people, what can I say? At the start of this pandemic, we saw disabled people struggling to even access food parcels or food deliveries. We've seen a government that failed to choose to communicate with them in accessible formats. The Prime Minister and his government failed to include British Sign Language interpretation as part of its daily press briefings, and even now they're failing to do that. And I know that they are being challenged legally on that. But also, the government rightly chose to uprate universal credit, which was the right thing to do, but they failed to uprate that in line with legacy benefits such as employment and support allowance and job seekers allowance, which mostly disabled people were in receipt of. So again, that hostile environment has been created for them. And then we move on to women. We know that the impact this virus has had on women has been disproportionate in the sense that, you know, when it came to childcare, they were most affected by that. We know that women were experiencing much discrimination in relation to maternity and pregnancy, with many women having to go through lots of antenatal meetings and so forth alone. And more heart-wrenching of all was the fact that there was a massive rise in domestic violence and online abuse, which is just a sad thing. And so far, the government's response to this crisis has not placed equality and has not placed women at its heart. The government chose to suspend gender pay gap reporting at the start of this pandemic. So that just tells you where they're at when it comes to equality. The government's failure on this whole pandemic has been evident. They have chosen not to publish in some cases or even carry out any equality impact assessments. You know, these assessments aren't just a tick box. They should really help shape and inform what policies are put in place to ensure that no community will be left worse off, and they've chosen not to do that. What they have come forward with is things like a new commission, when we've already seen that we don't need any more commissions because there are hundreds and hundreds of recommendations that they failed to implement that would actually close the gap on inequality and racial injustices. What we need this government to get this virus under control. This is the time for swift action, and we need a proper national plan to do this. And we cannot afford to be slow on this, because ultimately lives have been lost. And that's why it was absolutely right that our leader, Keir Starmer, called on the government to convene a COBRA meeting. But it's so important that this government get a grip on test, track and isolate. We need to increase our testing capacity, but also the tracing of it as well, and the isolating of this virus. We need to ensure this government chooses to communicate and uses communication mechanisms that are both inclusive and accessible. Because there's no point in just communicating and then they're excluding groups, those groups where English may not be their first language, or those people that require British Sign Language interpretation, or somebody like myself who's visually impaired will require their information in the right format. And we absolutely need to ensure that the government acts to prevent a jobs crisis, not a one size fits all. We need to protect our workers. We need to protect their rights. We need to see a boost to statutory sick pay. And we need to make sure that risk assessments are carried out in our workplaces to ensure that our workers are being protected. And we need to ensure that this government has proper enforcement mechanisms in place. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm so thrilled to be part of this panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing each and every one of you and what you have got to say and share on this crisis. Solidarity.
Thanks, Marsha. That was absolutely fantastic. And boy, look at all that you've just gone through, and it shows you how much work you're doing and the emotional connection to how the COVID crisis has been, disproportionately impacting on some people, and the lack of government ability to get on top of it, and the devastating impact that potentially has for people. So I'm really pleased that you were able to join us and introduce our session tonight. So thank you so much for those points. So now we're going to move on to Nell Andrew, who is the speaker from the GMB union, and she's going to talk about what has been the impact of COVID-19 on workers represented by the GMB. So Nell, we're absolutely thrilled to have you, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Angela. I am so proud and pleased to be here tonight and on this amazing panel, so thank you. We know that the COVID outbreak has had a devastating impact on working people, from key workers to people living under the threat of redundancy. The need for protections at work is greater than ever, and the burden of responding to COVID has not been shouldered equally. Black, Asian and minority ethnic workers, we've heard, are up to 3 times more likely to die. Disabled workers, including people with long-term health conditions like myself, have not been given the protections they need. 3/4 of the workers who are most exposed to the virus are women. Whenever there is poverty and prejudice and discrimination, COVID has left a trail of broken lives in its wake. They say that the virus does not discriminate, but it is clear that society does. Unions are here to fight back. We know from the last recession that these are often the workers who are most at risk of losing their jobs and may face additional barriers and discrimination to find new employment. At GMB, we were first round the table from day one, making the case for a programme of support for jobs. The job retention scheme might have been announced by a Conservative Chancellor, but it was a victory for the Labour movement. Now we need to secure ongoing support for the sectors most at risk. And where the government and employers did not step up, we worked with our BAME members to produce our own workplace risk assessments for the groups most at danger. Our reps and officers have worked tirelessly to secure the PPE that our members need. And colleagues, we know that lockdown has led to an increase in domestic abuse. We have always been clear that abuse and violence are industrial issues. And GMB has negotiated the adoption of our domestic abuse charter with a number of employers across the country. We've worked closely with our sister unions in sectors from health and care to schools to present a united front when our members are under threat, where employers have threatened our members with the sack if they did not sign inferior contracts, the fire and rehire tactic that Keir Starmer came out strongly against last week. We have fought back in the workplace, in Parliament and in the press. And when mass redundancies were threatened, such as at JCB, we've negotiated temporary agreements to protect jobs that otherwise would have been lost. We are in unprecedented times, and the worst may still be to come. So far, job losses and attacks on terms and conditions have been concentrated in the private sector, but more job losses are coming in the public sector too, where workers are more likely to be women, BAME, disabled. And if Conservative ministers try to undermine on our members' jobs or to attack on our hard-won rights or fail to honour the promises they have made, from protections for precarious workers to trans rights, we must stand united, because attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. We cannot rest. The whole of the Labour movement, the party and the unions must be allies in the battles ahead. And preserving what we have is not enough. The outbreak has exposed deep fault lines of structural and institutional discrimination in our society. We cannot go back to the way that things were. No more can politicians be allowed to turn a blind eye to poverty's statutory sick pay rates, which even now are hastening the spread of the virus. No more can society be allowed to turn a blind eye to our chronically underfunded care sector, where the minimum wage and precarious work have become the norm. And the new economy that we have to build together, equality, good work, inclusion by design, real rights to flexible working from day one for all, and proper enforcement against discrimination must be at its foundation. And as we campaign for that new economy, we know what our values are. Unity will always be our watchword. And in a modern trade union movement, diversity is strength too. GMB is the union of Eleanor Marx, Mary MacArthur, the Gruntwick strikers, and the first successful equal pay claims. The pursuit of equality and inclusion must be at the heart of everything we do. The labour movement at its best when it holds true to those values. And when we fail, we lose sight of that historic mission. As Will Thorne, who was the founder of GMB and one of the founders of the Labour Party, once said, "Inequality is not inevitable." He said, "While there is breath and life in me, I shall continue the fight. There is a world of freedom, beauty, and equality to gain. We cannot change the past, nor bring back those we have lost to this terrible disease, but we can fight for something better. Equality has never been given to us. It can only be won by the collective endeavour of working people. We believe that equality, dignity, and justice can be achieved, but only if we have the courage to fight for it. And that is what we need to do." Thank you.
Oh, Nell, thank you so much for that inspiring speech and just reminding us about the trade unions and how important they've been through this crisis. And if people didn't think being a member of a trade union was important before, they do know that now. And the work that GMB are doing to challenge, British Gas, fire and rehire, and the attacks on terms and conditions with BT and others, you've got our support all the way with that, and BA as well, they're on notice because they've been doing it, and all these companies that think that they can do this, well, me and Kira have said we're not having any of that. You're taking taxpayers' money and therefore using it to undermine staff terms and conditions is disgusting, and you have our support all the way. And that was such an inspiring speech, so thank you so much for your contribution. I'm going to go over to another inspiring woman who has done so much for our movement and will not take no or know your place for an action, and she's from my union as well, and she's been an absolute stalwart in making our movement really understand where our weaknesses are, because we can't inform the government if we don't get our own house in order. And she needs not much more of an introduction, and I'm over to Fran Springfield, who's going to say what the impact of COVID-19 has been on disability inequality. So Fran, over to you, honey.
Angela, thank you, and thank you to Marsha for that really warm introduction from both of you. I too feel very honoured to be part of this today. Well, what do we know about COVID and disabled people? What we know is that almost 60% of those who died from COVID had a disability that impacted their lives. And of that 60%, 31% had a disability which impacted a great deal on their lives, and 29% their disability impacted slightly less. But then we know that disabled people very often underrate how much our disability affects us. We also know from a study that was published yesterday at Dublin University that over 50% of people recovering from COVID, 10 weeks plus on, are still having major problems with symptoms: pain, brain fog, lack of energy, lack of ability to walk, all of those things which people, for instance, who've got ME would be very, very familiar with. So we know that long COVID exists. I've been contacted in the last few weeks by two people in particular. One is one of my own nursing colleagues who was 6 weeks on a ventilator in his own ICU, who then, still recovering, still not able to go back to work, was actually turned down by the DWP for benefits. Another was a young woman in her 30s. She wasn't actually even admitted to hospital, and yet she now can barely concentrate, struggled to have a 15-minute conversation with me on a phone because she was so breathless. She can't walk up or downstairs, and she's now using a wheelchair to get around. And that is to say, with somebody who wasn't even hospitalised. So what we know about COVID-19 is that it means more disabled people. The Disability News Service came up with something like 17 ways in which disabled people's rights were breached during the COVID crisis, and I would encourage you to go and look at that, because I'm not going to quote them all here, but what I do want to quote is the survey from Inclusion London, which is the overall umbrella group for disabled groups within London. And that survey showed that over 60% of us had trouble accessing food and meds during lockdown. I certainly had trouble with both. Often food parcels which were given out by the local authorities weren't ideal. They contained foods that people either couldn't eat or couldn't manage to open because they were in really difficult tins and things like that. Lots of us couldn't get our usual online deliveries, and people who needed assistance to shop were often turned down because there was only one person allowed per time, and they weren't allowing anybody with that person to accompany them. That had a major impact on people, for instance, who were autistic or people who were visually impaired and needed somebody else to be their eyes. There were major issues too with who should and shouldn't be on that extremely vulnerable list. I had a GP who was really good, and when she realised I wasn't on the list and I should have been, she hastily got me onto it. I had other friends who, equally as disabled as I am, were told they didn't count and had to be taken off and then got put back on again. It was a complete farce of knowing who was what and what was who in terms of that. Of course, many of us lost any form of psychological help that we might have had before the crisis because there was no face-to-face support going on. And over 30% to 35% of people said they suffered increasing levels of psychological distress. And I certainly saw that amongst many of the people that I talked to. 50% of people found the information from the government inaccessible and confusing. Well, we know that because we know they didn't actually have interpreters. And indeed, the whole thing about, well, do we still have support bubbles? Are we still just rules of six and the support bubbles have gone? People are still confused by all of that. And many people, of course, lost out because their carers didn't have PPE, so they were too scared to have carers in their home. And that, of course, put a huge burden on their families to provide that level of care and support. As Marsha pointed out, most of us failed to get the £20 upgrade that Universal Credit gave to people. That's over £500 that I and other disabled people lost throughout all that. It's hard now, and it was harder then, to even get COVID testing for staff. So staff were still coming into work not knowing whether they were COVID infected or not. 40% of disabled people said their carers had major difficulties getting PPE. And other people, of course, reported losing their care packages because there weren't enough carers to go around. Huge issues with disabled people and their relatives being asked to sign do not resuscitate agreements just as a blanket thing because you had a disability. Well, because somebody had a learning disability who was autistic. How wrong is that? Condemned to die because of a condition? Most of us are still having problems with things like shopping. The other point I would make before I go on to talk back about that is that experiencing from the phone calls we're getting into disability labour, as furlough ends, it seems it's disabled people who are getting made redundant the first. The first people the firm starts looking at as they realise they've got to start paying workers again. Many of us are seeing already that the medications that we had trouble getting at the beginning of the last lockdown are coming back. I certainly have had major problems trying to get some of the meds that I need because they're sending me generic versions rather than the actual correct versions that I need. So, and that causes problems for me with reactions to allergies. In the last lockdown, I struggled to get the EpiPens I need for the severe allergies that I have. Thankfully, I've actually not got out, so I've not needed my EpiPens. I'm fairly careful, so I still have my stock, thank goodness, but I know other people that are running out and getting really scared. I started to shield about 10 days before the last lockdown, and basically I've not really stopped shielding. I'm not going out. I've only gone out to go to medical appointments and to do one really important visit for a Labour Party group. Most of us still feel too scared. Most of us are worried that lots of people out there are still not wearing masks, that they're still not social distancing. Many of us, say, are still too scared. Many of us are starting to go back into lockdown again because that at least will give us some safety. So what do we need from all of this? We need a repeal of the legislation which suspended the Care Act. That has to go. We need direct involvement and co-production with local authorities and local disabled groups on how food parcels and other support to people is delivered and how people get extra support. I helped to run the local COVID group here, and we were inundated with requests for help for food in Vauxhall. A lot of that help, by the way, came from people with no recourse to public funds who were left absolutely penniless during lockdown. And a lot of the women that we were dealing with were also victims of domestic violence. So an absolute double blow for them. I sat in tears some nights from some of the stories that I heard. But ultimately, there are things that a government could be doing. There are things that the next Labour government must do, and that strengthen the Equality Act. Make sure that there are investigatory and regulatory powers for the whatever body will replace the current Equality Committee. And finally, we must enshrine the United Nations rights of disabled people into UK law. That's the absolute vital thing, because that will give us all the basic protections that we as disabled members and disabled people need. And I look forward to working with Angela and Marsha and seeing that happen with the next Labour government. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Fran, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. And, you know, it really puts in perspective the fear that people have when they've been left without the support they need and that they should get. So it was a real personal account, but also something that I think everyone who's listening to this rally will be able to really get a feel and a sense of how this pandemic has affected people. So thank you so much for your contribution, and I apologise, I've had to go into my iPad because my internet is being rubbish at the moment, so if I've gone like a robot at any times or not been there for you, I apologise. Now I think my sister Emily is somewhere, well, she's not driving at the moment, she's in a car. I don't know if she's been kicked out of her house or something, maybe she can let us know, but our next speaker doesn't need any introduction. She is full of sass. And in fact, before I took Boris Johnson on this Wednesday, she gave me top tips because she was the woman who was kicking him around that dispatch box before I even got the chance and before Keir did. So without any further ado, Emily Thornberry MP is going to tell us how can international trade promote gender equality and what should activists be calling for to tackle the global gender gap. And I'm sure she's going to say something about horrible Boris as well. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Angela. And thank you, once again for showing this week that if there's one thing that Boris Johnson can't take, it's a tough woman holding him to account. And you did that brilliantly. So congratulations. It's wonderful to be joining you today. And we all wish it was in different circumstances. We wish that we were together in Liverpool, but we are together in spirit and we are united in our mission. And that's what matters most. And yeah, it does look like I'm, in an episode of Carpool Karaoke, but I'm not. James Corden is not about to get in the car with me. I was going from one event to another and got caught on the time. So so I'm broadcasting from my car in the middle of Hackney. But I want to speak to you briefly today about the issues of gender and international trade. And I have to say, I probably have to start on one issue on which we're all definitely united. We do not want our country being represented around the world by Tony Bloody Abbott. Tony Bloody Abbott, a man who said that women didn't have the right temperament to take on leadership roles. A man who said that his greatest achievement for women was cutting energy taxes because they're the ones doing the ironing. A man who stood next to female candidates standing for office and when asked what their strengths were, said that they were local and had sex appeal. It's an election. It's an election for a leader. It's not a meat market. A man who heard a 67-year-old woman on a telephone phone-in describing her chronic health problems and her money problems and the fact that she'd been forced to work on an adult sex line just to make ends meet, and whose reaction wasn't to sympathize or to think, what it must be like for this woman or if it had been his mother or grandmother. But no, what did he do? He smirked and laughed with the other male presenters and winked at them. When one of my friends and my heroes, Julia Gillard, tore Tony Abbott to pieces over his misogyny in the Australian Parliament, and if you haven't seen it yet, it's on YouTube. Do it. It's a thing of joy. But anyway, so she takes him on and she's telling to Tony Abbott, about what a misogynist he is and so forth, and what a sexist he is. And one of Tony Abbott's party colleagues tried to kind of defend him. She's called Sue Boyce, and she said, he's not a misogynist. She said, that's totally unfair. I know him really well. He's just a sexist. Well, all of us no different. We've all experienced in our own lives when men repeatedly say and do things like that. They aren't gaffes. They aren't mistakes. They go to the heart of how they see women and their place in the world. And it's the mindset of a misogynist. But the real scandal about this appointment was when Liz Truss, the Secretary of State for Trade, but also the Minister of Women and Equalities, was asked to justify her comments about Tony Abbott, about what Tony Abbott had said, not just against women, but against LGBT plus people and minorities. And her response, her shameful response, was this: I am, she said, the Minister for Women and Equalities in Britain. So it doesn't matter what Tony Abbott has said to women, same-sex couples and minorities in Australia, because that's none of her business. And again, that wasn't a gaffe, that wasn't a mistake. It goes to the heart of how this government thinks about the world, and certainly it goes to the heart of how they think about trade. Because here's the thing, we've not been in charge of our own trade policy in Britain because of being in the EU, and we haven't had our own independent trade policy for 50 years. And even those of us who opposed Brexit can see that there is something historic and significant in the opportunity that this gives us to have an entirely fresh look at how we approach trade as a country. But we need to have vision. We need to seize the chance to take issues that were not a priority when they should have, and they should have been back in 1973, issues like gender equality or human rights or labor laws or climate change, and put those issues into the heart of our trade policy and the deals that we make around the world. It's an opportunity to say to countries that we do deals with, but we'll do deals with you, but we want you to make progress on equal pay for equal work, on equal access to education and healthcare, on women's reproductive rights, on trade union rights. But Liz Truss isn't interested in any of that. Of the 19 deals that the Tories have signed since Brexit, not a single one makes a new commitment on the issue of gender equality. But it's worse than that. The trade deal that Liz Truss did with Kosovo in December last year actually took out the clause in the equivalent EU agreement that we're supposed to be rolling over, took out the clause that related to equal opportunities for women and improving women's working conditions. Again, this isn't a gaffe, it isn't a mistake, it's a deliberate, conscious decision from a government that only cares about the financial implications of trade, not about the lives that it could help. That's why we saw representatives of that terrible regime of Turkmenistan invited to London for a summit in 2018 on the opportunities for UK business 10 days after they'd banned women from driving. That's why we saw the red carpet rolled out later that year for the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, with Boris Johnson praising him as a reformer because he was allowing Saudi women to drive cars, but not mentioning the fact that there were Saudi women who had campaigned for those rights, had been arrested, imprisoned, and threatened with death. And that's why, of course, we continue to see this Tory government bending over backwards to appease the Crown Prince of sexual abuse, Donald Trump, even as he steps up his assault on the rights of women to control their own bodies, both in America and around the world. And we will see what he does about replacing the majestic Ruth Ginsburg who's died today, and he needs to appoint someone else to the Supreme Court, and what kind of reactionary he will put and how that person will again try to roll back the rights of women. I digress. Under a Labour government, it can and will be different. We have a leader in Keir and strong female ministers like Angie, Marsha, Lisa and Annalise, who will never think that it is not their responsibility to promote equality and justice, and to make sure, and they will never think that responsibility stops at our borders, because we will always seek to use every lever that we have, including the deals that we make in international trade, to improve the lives of women, both in Britain and around the world. And can I leave you with one final thought, which perhaps sums this up and certainly shows, in my mind, why it matters. If I asked you all which country has been stuck at the bottom of the global rankings for gender equality going back 14 years, I don't know how many of you would know. But that country is Yemen. And it is now the 6th year of the war. And there is gender inequality in Yemen, which is not just measured as it historically has been by lack of opportunity, by restrictions on freedom and grinding poverty. It's now measured in the routine nature of sexual violence, in the emaciated little bodies of girls dying from malnutrition, and in the thousands more sold off as child brides by families desperate to feed their sons. A Labour government could not fix all those problems, but we can promise one thing. A Labour government would never turn our face away, let alone keep selling arms that Saudi Arabia is using to fuel that dreadful war. But that is all we'll get from the Tories on Yemen, and that's all we'll get from Liz Truss on trade, and that's all we can expect from our current Minister for Women. And my friends, my sisters, with your support and with all our combined effort, it really is time to put that to an end. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Angie.
Oh, Emily, your speeches are always lovely and invoke like passion in us and anger, especially when you mention people like Tony Abbott and then, you know, like Donald Trump and some of the takedowns that you've done on these. But you also remind us that this is a global issue and women's equality doesn't stop at our border, and how important it is for all us sisters to do that. And with the death of Jill as well, reminding us that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And we've got to continue that fight. So thank you so much for your contributions and everything you've contributed to the Labour Party and the movement as well, which is great. We are running slightly behind time, so I'm going to remind speakers to try and be amazingly short as well, because I am failing in my duties as chair, so I apologise in advance. But I am going to bring in Jill Murdoch now, who is a representative of the TSSA union, which is the transport union, and she's going to talk about her experiences on the transport infrastructure and how we build on the experience to transform what our transport system is for the benefit of all. So Jill, you're more than welcome and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's amazingly an honour and deeply daunting to be part of this amazing panel. If there are any doubts about structural inequalities in society, you have only to look at PPE in hospitals. Healthcare workers use it regularly, even in normal times, yet it has taken the pandemic to reveal that PPE is not only in short supply, but is also made to fit the male body shape, meaning it is less protective of female workers. This despite the fact that 75% of frontline healthcare workers are female. Providers have only looked at what is still deemed to be the default worker. Similarly, public transport systems are designed around the assumption that most users are able-bodied men. Steep steps up to train carriages and into buses are little help to mothers, nor fathers come to that, with babies in prams, and even less use to disabled passengers. Timetables for rail and bus are typically designed around commuters, leaving those left at home with scarce and unreliable services in the main part of the day. Usage of public transport is hugely reduced at the moment due to COVID, but people will come back to it, and it will have to be a central part of the green revolution that must come when we are able again to focus on the longer-term crisis of climate change. The Labour Party must be at the forefront of that revolution, and we need now to look at how public transport can serve the needs of all members of society. In the transport industry, PPE was not provided for workers at all at the height of the COVID crisis. Frontline workers in transport are the lowest paid in the industry, and many of them are women, and a high proportion of them are black. At least 45 frontline workers in Transport for London and at least 10 workers in Network Rail died of COVID. A member of TSSA, Belly Mujinga, a ticket inspector at Euston, died of COVID, probably as a result of being spat at by a passenger who claimed to have the disease. She was a key worker, yet her employers had given her no protection, and the government is refusing to compensate her family in the way they have compensated the families of frontline NHS workers. TSSA is fighting hard for this. All of these frontline workers, mostly women, are now recognised as key to the operation of the country. They received gratitude and platitudes at the time, but get rewarded with the lowest pay and no sign of any change to that coming. The current government places no value on these workers at all. As Diana Holland said earlier today, throughout history, there has been a consistent undervaluing of work done by women. Public industries themselves are little valued in this individualised society. Railways and buses have been privatised and fragmented by a Tory government, with the obvious result that workers' wages have to be kept as low as possible for the sake of profit. NHS services are being outsourced at a frightening speed with the same effect and the same rationale, causing fragmentation and incoherence as on the railway. Even the testing system for COVID is in private hands, with the shockingly chaotic result that we see today. But not to worry, Serco and Deloitte shareholders are happy. Private enterprise has no place in these public services. A Labour government must reverse all these privatisations as a top priority and demonstrate the value that we as a Labour movement place on their activities and particularly on their workers. It should not have taken a crisis such as this for that value to be recognised. The TSSA and other rail unions will continue to fight to finally end the damaging policy of privatisation. To give credit where it is due, a number of train operating companies have made transport free during lockdown to women who are fleeing domestic abuse, which has doubled in the period. It is hoped that this policy continues, as the upcoming surge in unemployment after the end of the furlough scheme will inevitably lead to a further increase in domestic violence. It is good to hear Keir Starmer call for targeted support to businesses and workers after the furlough scheme ends. The transport and travel trade industries are desperately in need of such help after the stop-start policies of this government have thrown it into chaos and made what was always going to be a difficult recovery even harder. It is particularly important to women, as travel trade jobs are largely occupied by women. In fact, in the economy as a whole, in the current crisis, women's jobs are nearly twice as likely to be lost as men's jobs. I was also pleased to hear that Keir plans to deal with rogue employers like British Airways, who have, to their eternal shame, openly taken advantage of the COVID crisis to force, under threat of job loss, new contracts on their mostly female cabin crew with significantly worse paying conditions. Employers of that type do not belong in the 21st century. We need bold policies from Labour to show how structural inequalities of all kinds will be destroyed. everyone will be safer and stronger in a fairer, balanced structure where key workers, women workers, and all workers receive the recognition that they fully deserve. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill, and thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And I stole one of your former colleagues, Sam Tarry, who became the Member of Parliament for Ilford South, and I know has championed the causes whilst he's been in Parliament, and a member of my team as well. And the Belly Majinga case really highlights what the frontline workers have had to face during this pandemic. And again, you know, tackling BA and rogue employers that are seeing it as an opportunity, a disgraceful opportunity to bring down workers. And the work that you're doing is so important. So thank you for your contribution. And moving swiftly on, amazing Sonia, who's on. And me and Sonia shared panels before, and Sonia Adesara is a doctor on the front line, doing amazing work for us all, keeping us all safe. So thank you so much for the day job, but also working all the hours God sends. She still is very active as well, and is always an amazing smile and lots of intellect for us. So Sonia, over to you, honey.
Hello everyone at home. Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be on such a brilliant panel today of women. And like others have said, the virus has simply unveiled the injustices that we knew were entrenched in our society. And I agree with what Nell said. Stopping the clock is just not enough. We need a new clock. We cannot go back to normal, because the unfair and the unjust way that this virus is hurting communities was not unexpected. So before coronavirus, racialized minorities, the working classes, those without wealth were already dying prematurely. So we knew before this virus hit that your postcode could determine your life expectancy. If you're living in a deprived area of this country, your life could be cut short by 10 years. If you're a Black woman, your risk of dying in childbirth is 5 times that of a white woman. If you are an infant to a Black or Asian mother, your risk of dying is 2 to 3 times higher than a white infant. And I think it's been quite unfortunate over the past few months that we've heard Tory politicians and the media and some doctors try to explain away these inequalities with racial pseudoscience, talking about genetics, suggesting that Black and brown bodies are, innately weaker than white bodies. And I guess because this is more comfortable to them than addressing the reality that we know that our health is very much a product of the social world around you. And the systems of privilege that many seek to uphold are intertwined with systems of oppression that are harmful and harm the health of many others. And the factors that have led to, that we know increase your risk of getting the virus, so your housing conditions, poor housing, overcrowded housing, your work conditions, low paid work, insecure work, not being able to isolate, not being able to protect yourself. These are the same factors that have always increased your risk of poor health. So, again, before this virus, I knew my patients that wouldn't be coming in to get their diabetes checked because their work wouldn't give them time off. I knew the postcodes in my area where the housing conditions are so bad and the air is so polluted that I'll be seeing children being admitted with breathing problems. I've seen people with nutritional deficiencies because their diet is so poor. So I think we need to, and also, as Marsha articulated this so well, we need to understand that racism in itself exasperates these vulnerabilities, and racism kills. And, it's not always as vivid as a boot on one's neck, but the way that racism subtly permeates our structures and our systems can be just as harmful and just as deadly. And of course, we know that these inequalities haven't just happened. So we have had 10 years now of our communities being stripped of investment. We've had 10 years now of our care services being deprived of funds. We have had welfare cuts that deliberately intended to hurt the most vulnerable. And we have had the populist rhetoric that has divided and weakened the working people, that has fueled the injustices that we are seeing today, and has fueled and is the cause behind the premature deaths that we've seen over the past few months. And I just want to, Nell said this, and it's funny because I often get told by my colleagues that my head is in the sky when I say this, but inequality is not inevitable. And that's why I am in the Labour Party. And we know that the Labour government, when they were last in power, the gap narrowed, they reduced health inequality, they improved the health of those without wealth, and the health of our whole nation improved in the 2000s under the last Labour government. And now we're at a turning point. And, you know, as Marsha clearly said, if we don't, without intervention, the impact of this virus will deepen these injustices and these inequalities. And, you know, the Tories have showed that they do not have the ability or the intention to deal with this. They'd rather manufacture culture wars than address these long-standing health injustices. So we in the Labour movement need to be very clear and need to be strong on this. And whether you are a black Uber driver in London, or whether you are a brown single mum in Bolton, or whether you are a white factory worker in Glasgow, the systems of oppression that harm your health and that cut your life short are the same. And the Labour Party needs to show the country, needs to show this nation that we have the ambition and we have the vision to rethink and rebuild this system. And we need to have the courage to stand up to racism and to dismantle these systems of oppression that are harming too many of our communities and that are cutting lives short. So it's not just about stopping the clock, we need to get a new clock face. Thank you very much for having me, and can't wait to see the rest of the speakers.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you for that message that I think is very hard hitting but needs to be said, and racism kills. And I think that's a message that we all need to understand. And, you know, Black Lives Matter and what we've seen happen during this pandemic, again, just really shows that this was a problem before COVID, and we've got to be vigilant of that. And our penultimate speaker is Maria Exall, and Maria and I know each other for a very long time as well through the Labour movement. We're one big happy family. So if you've joined the Labour movement recently, then welcome. You'll know each other for years. We'll be like sisters forever, I promise you. But Maria is a fantastic activist in our movement and has been standing up for women's rights, and in particular rights around the LGBT plus community. And Maria, it's an absolute honour to have you on the panel today. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Angela. We need to look to the future to make women's equality a reality in these new times. Equality must be at the heart of Labour's vision for the post-pandemic world. We know the Tories have their own agenda during this crisis, and it doesn't include equality. They're not acting for the good of all, but for the good of their own. Instead of delivering PPE and proper test, trace and track systems that actually work, they have awarded contracts and mega profits to their cronies and donors. Coming out of this COVID crisis is going to be their socio-economic policies, however, that will be the biggest danger to women's equality. Our alternative Labour vision of building back better has got to put the priorities of working class women at the centre of our party programme. That's how we'll win the next election. We need to promise more jobs in properly funded public services, in publicly owned and planned infrastructure, such as transport and technology, and that means buses and broadband. We need to promise support for local government to aid communities tackling food poverty and homelessness. During this crisis, the Tories have left those with caring responsibilities to fend for themselves. I say never again. We need a national care service with those overwhelmingly women workers being paid well, because they do one of the most important jobs in our society, keeping people safe and healthy. We need proper social security for all, not punitive and inadequate welfare. And we need proper sick pay now for those shielding themselves or shielding others. We need to roll back all the privatisations within the NHS and in other essential services. We need to emphatically turn away from the wasted decade of austerity we have just endured, and the failed market fundamentalism that has dominated politics over the last 40 years. In order to cover up their failures to meet the challenges of the pandemic, the Tories are up to their usual tricks. dividing the working class. They are reviving the myths that worked for them in the Brexit vote and enlisting the support of their alt-right friends to propagate their brazen lies. They're demonising migrants and asylum seekers and those from minority ethnic communities. But we in the Labour movement won't be divided. We know that Black Lives Matter. And the Tories would love us to fall for their culture war on gender identity too. But we won't. As a socialist feminist and a trade unionist, I support my trans sisters and brothers. I support non-binary people's rights and a future where we can be ourselves in all our glorious diversity. Those of us who are LGBT+ remember only too well how a majority Tory government scapegoated us and provoked division within working class communities in the 1980s, all to distract from the consequences of their disastrous economic policy. Then they called social progress political correctness. Now they call it cancel culture. Now they justify reactionary views in the name of free speech. But bigotry is nothing to do with freedom, and everything to do with keeping people trapped by fear. Our values are the opposite of this. We hope for a more liberated society, for greater equality and respect for all. We need to recognise how the COVID crisis is affecting different communities in different ways and support each other. There are many challenges for LGBT+ people in this crisis. At a time of lockdowns, many have found themselves isolated from the support networks, from friends, from LGBT venues and meeting places, from specialist services. This has effects on mental health, especially the young or vulnerable LGBT people. In the deeply homophobic, biphobic and transphobic society we live in, for many, home is not a safe space. And LGBT and in even greater proportion T people experience hostility in their own neighbourhoods. Many LGBT+ workers deliberately chose to work in sectors where it's easier to be out. Yet many of these sectors are the very ones where jobs are disappearing. We, along with all workers, need targeted extensions of the furlough scheme now. We cannot risk mass unemployment with all the problems we know this leads to. Poverty, mass evictions, and the obliteration of hope. If we, as party members and Labour trade unionists, work together to promote working class women's interests and aspirations, we can win power and deliver real change. Thanks, Andy.
Oh, thank you so much, Maria. And, and thank you for also mentioning Section 28 and what happened around that and where hate speech takes us and actually showing us that what the Labour movement have been able to do over the years. And, anyone who's seen the film Pride will see how the coal miners were out there and were able, our solidarity in the movement, we're not just binary on one issue, we come together. And that's what's so great about our movement. And thank you so much for the work that you've been doing. I want to move on to our last speaker tonight, who punctuated my childhood. I was 13 when Stephen Lawrence was murdered. And it has always been something that I remember. I think it traumatised the nation. And thinking back at the time, I remember justice didn't come easy for Baroness Lawrence. And she was the original Tiger Mum, as far as I'm concerned, because when most of us would have been in a pit of despair, actually Doreen was out there, despite her heart being absolutely broken, went out there and fought for every single child in this country of colour and said, we will not have this, we will not accept this. She set up a charitable trust in her son's memory, and she's an absolute amazing woman, and I'm so pleased to have her on the call. And Doreen Lawrence, Baroness Lawrence, over to you.
Thanks, Angela. But listening to all these amazing women this evening, I just feel that I'm not as brave as many of you women have to all the things you've done over the years. Because I think for those of you in the unions fighting for justice and fighting all these years, okay, I think for Stephen and stuff, yes, as a mum, and I think any mum will do the same. So, I don't see myself as that special. Looking at the COVID and the review, taking the lead role. I felt at the time when I asked to be the race advisor, I think it was just so important that I think within the Labour movement that we needed to do something. I think for years within around race inequality, that's been going on. And I just wanted to be a voice for so many people. But I think what COVID has done is just highlight the inequality that's been happening for decades. And so listening to around the stuff around disability and how the women, it just highlights what it is that women's been going through. And what the COVID has done is brought it to the forefront. And we have been, not physically, but on the Zoom up and down the country, speaking to various people, speaking to unions, speaking to local authorities, speaking to nurses, speaking to doctors as about the effect as COVID has had on their community. And I think one of the things I won't forget, and in fact somebody said that in this meeting, I think it's Sonia, who talks about that racism kills. One nurse said that I didn't go to work to die. And that's the impact of what COVID has had. The fact that risk assessment hasn't been done, the fact around the PPE, the shielding, all the things that should have been happening to frontline workers weren't happening. And there was one point where I felt where the health secretary more or less was blaming the Black communities about the level of death. What they were saying, that they're not listening to what the government is saying about, what protection that they should be doing. And it's a bit like the track and trace at the moment. They're still blaming people for that and saying that people are going to have the test when they don't need to. But unless you have the test, you do not know if you've got the virus. So to say that people are flooding these test centres is yet again, they're blaming the community. They don't have the things in place, PPE, they never had that in place. Where the mask did not fit many of the women. There were so many things that's happening that the government did not take control over. But yet as usual, it comes back on the community. You're not doing this, or you're exposing yourself even more than you should. I think that around the COVID is the tip of the iceberg. So when you listen to Fran, you just think, you talk about the food and how people get their food and the type of food that they have. It's the wrong food or not able to go to shopping. How does people cope with that? This is just the tip of the iceberg. How are we going to move forward in the next, 6 months? If we're having as much as what we're having now, so many people are dying, what is the government doing in order to support those people and to make sure that they're protected? Everything is done on the hoof, or they've been sort of pushed into submission. Why aren't they planning and strategizing and making sure that they know exactly what the next steps are going to be? Our review that I've been working with Marsha on, it is looked to be out by the end of September, probably the beginning of October. And I feel that within that, you will see a lot more. For me, it was speaking to ordinary people, understanding where they were coming from. I think we need to hear the voices of those who are suffering. Because I think, you can always have the professors and that doing the research, but unless you hear the impact it has had on individuals, you have no idea what people have been living through. So for me, as we went around the country, is to make sure that we're hearing the voices of people. People are dying, and there was one person who said that a member of his family died, and everybody that came to his house and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't take the body because we do not have a PPE." How distressing is that the family has to go through that? There were so many of those things that we were hearing. The unions are talking, we hear about the unions who are talking today about the impact it's got on their members around the transport. There is so much. And as I say, I think what we did in the how many months that we've done is just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm not sure exactly how we're going to move forward, because I think we have not come to the end of COVID as yet. And what the government is doing, we're going to have another lockdown. How does people and their families? I've got grandchildren, and during that time, I didn't see. Are we going to go through all that again? The government just needs to start planning and exactly how they're going to move forward and stop relying on and blaming people for their deaths, for the fact that they need to be tested. Children are not going back to school. The fact that they did not plan for schools going back. Kids have been off of school for over 5-6 months. They've missed their education, and there's so much they haven't done to improve that. I have a granddaughter, 16, and so she's one of those children that missed out on her exam. And when it came to her assessment, she did not get the grade that she needed. And, you know, and children are suffering for that. You know, university students are going to university and still, and as a young person said on the news, that the government are blaming us now for, as COVID is beginning to take over again, that we are being blamed. So the government needs, they need to get to grips. They really need to get to grips. And as I say, thank you all for being here. It's a privilege for me because I'm not a spokesperson, as many of you are. And so I'm sitting here listening. I'm just thinking, oh, I'm in awe of all of you. And I think all the work that you've been doing and working for your union, working for individuals and making sure that you're covering and speaking up for them. Because if they don't have a voice, you're going to be their voices for them. And I think that's what I tried to do over the years, is to be the voices of other people who are not able to be in that position to do that. And thank you all for allowing me to be on the panel with you.
Oh, Baroness Lawrence, you know, we didn't allow you. You gave us the opportunity to be. Like I say, I was 13 at the time when I saw you on our screen, inspiring us. And ever since, you continue to do that. And I've given you a massive virtual hug and thanking you for what you've done. And you're quite right. We've got to stop blaming the government. I've got to stop blaming people. And we really look forward to looking at that review and then pushing the government and making sure that it's implemented and that those voices do need to be heard. And I know we've gone over time, and I think it was necessary, because how many phenomenal women have I had on the panel tonight? Yeah. And it's been absolutely fantastic, everyone involved, and thank you to the staff that have helped. And I'm just going to, now just before we finish, I'm just going to bring Marsha back in, who's going to give us a rallying call to action, because it's not a rally unless we have a call to action. So Marsha, over to you, honey.
Brilliant. Thank you, Angie. And can I just really echo what you said, Ange? You know, Doreen, you have been incredible. And, you know, I feel so privileged and honoured to be working with you and sharing a platform with you, because your voice has been the voice of so many mothers and so many others, and is such a strong voice for our community. So if I can just say a massive thank you. Now, obviously, everybody else, you have been incredible, but you know, it's been really fantastic hearing such powerful speeches from across our movement. And I will say, you know, I think it was may have been Sonia that said it, but you know, diversity is our strength, and they will seek to try and divide us. But it's so important that us as a movement, with all our different characteristics, women, LGBTQ+, disabled people, Black people, whoever we are, we have to unite and fight against this government, but more importantly, fight against the racial injustices and those structural inequalities that exist. You know, and going forward, it is totally, absolutely right that equalities has to be at the heart of everything that we do. As we prepare over the coming years and we shape our policies, equalities has to be at the heart of all of that. And our response, we are an internationalist movement, so our response globally also needs to reflect that. We will ensure that women and girls are not subject to what they're being subjected to right now, which Emily so eloquently put for us. We have to ensure those trade deals that we do has to have equal opportunities and protecting our women in the workplace as part of any deals we do. And it's a disgrace that this, well, it's not a disgrace, it's a scandal, frankly, that this government are doing what they're doing. But sisters, we will all be united in our fight for justice and in our fight for equality and in our fight against this deadly virus that has already taken so many lives. And we have to work together to ensure that we can bring about that positive change. Thank you.
Thank you, Marsha.
Also, sorry, Angie, before we go, after we end this session, there will be a 10-minute break, but then come back for our final session of Women Connected.
Thank you, Marsha, and thank you to everyone who's been on the call tonight and listened to our fantastic speakers, Marsha, Doreen, Maria, Jill, Nell, Sonia, Fran and Emily. You're all inspirational, phenomenal women, and today I think has been an absolute amazing, uplifting day. Don't get mad, get organised, and that's what we've been doing. So thank you everyone for being on the call. Thank you for the staff that have helped us do this. I'm really sorry that I suck as a chair and I went over, but I don't care because I'm a feminist and therefore we're not sticking to the rules. So thank you so much, everyone. Have an absolute amazing evening. Take care. Bye.